begin so as to be on time, and a recording of this panel will also be available on YouTube for later viewing. Adya, could you give me the recording rights, please?
All yours, Priyanka. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Hello and a very warm welcome to the panel discussion on opportunities for a more inclusive Indian foreign policy, co-hosted by Kubernein Initiative and the India office of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. My name is Priyanka Bhide, and I'm the co-founder and director of Kubernein Initiative. We have been engaging with the support of our partners in discussions around gender mainstreaming in foreign policy and feminist foreign policy. Beginning with Sweden in 2014, several countries, including Canada, France, Mexico, and now Germany, have embarked on diverse paths to adopt their own versions of such a policy, lending to the widening scope of its context-specific interpretation. We are trying to unpack what that may be for India and how India could contribute to the growing global discussion. To explore the idea of a more inclusive foreign policy, we have with us today our esteemed panelists. Let me introduce you, and Adya, I will ask you to spotlight our panelists as I introduce them, please. Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, who's a former Indian Foreign Service officer and ambassador. She was Assistant Secretary General, United Nations, and the founding Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Ambassador Puri is a distinguished fellow of Indian Association of International Studies and recipient of the prestigious Eleanor Roosevelt Prize for Human Rights. We also have with us His Excellency Federico Salas Lotfe, Ambassador of Mexico to India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. Ambassador Salas is a career diplomat who has previously served as ambassador to the Czech Republic, Israel, and Indonesia, and permanent representative to UNESCO. I would now like to hand over this session to our fantastic moderator, Mitali Mukherjee, who is a well-known face in the world of journalism here, with over 2 decades of experience working extensively on political economy, gender, and finance with various media houses. Mitali is presently the consulting business editor at The Wire and also lead gender initiatives and fellow at Observer Research Foundation. Over to you, Mitali.
Priyanka, thank you so much for that. Clearly, though, the rookie in the room or the virtual room today in terms of foreign policy insight. So I'm very, very glad to have 2 stalwarts joining me to talk about this. Before we begin, it is a bit of a somber day in India. We've had some disturbing news over the last few hours. There's been a tragic helicopter crash in the southern part of India in Tamil Nadu. Our chief of defense staff and some members of his family were on board. We're praying for the safety, the healing, and peace for everyone who has been impacted by this tragedy indeed. And we cannot not mention it in the context of what we're going to be discussing today, which is building foreign policy, building a more feminist approach to policy building, really. But first and foremost, my warmest thanks to both my guests for joining in and speaking with me today. So honored to have both of you. I thought we might start with some introductory remarks, but perhaps I could, if I may, lay a little bit of a path before you and encourage you to frame your answers along that path. Ambassador Salas, I'd like to start with you actually, particularly because of how special your country is in terms of where it's located on this feminist conversation. Mexico is the first Latin American and global South country to have adopted feminist foreign policy explicitly, but the movement actually started all the way back in 2015 for you, where you started talking about gender focal points. Walk us through what the journey has been so far and what the highlight learnings have been already.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me say that I'm very grateful to be included in this panel, and I'm very honored to be participating here with Ambassador Lakshmi Puri, whom I know from a reputation and from all that she has done especially her trajectory at the United Nations. As you correctly said, the Mexico has been the first country in Latin America and the first one in the global South that has adopted a feminist foreign policy. This, however, was sort of the culmination of a long process that was started probably even before 2015. It was an evolution. We had our first foreign minister, female foreign minister, at the end of the 90s. Rosario Gri, who was also an Undersecretary General of the UN at one point. And she really was a force of to push forward the idea of empowering more women, of having more women participating in questions of foreign policy, of having more women as the personnel in the foreign service in Mexico, and naming some very distinguished women as ambassadors of Mexico. So this has been, probably a trajectory that's been in the making for over 20 years. And I think that, some of the highlights, as you mentioned, has been, the consolidation of certain, policies that we have been pursuing in our different initiatives of foreign policy, sort of having a gender perspective in the implementation of our foreign policy. And let me give you a concrete example. Just recently, in the past month of November, Mexico was presiding the Security Council of the United Nations, where we are non-permanent members together with India. And we included in many of the debates that took place, and in the nature of the debates that took place, this gender perspective, sort of bring it to the fore of such an important forum as the Security Council, so that issues that have to do, for example, of women in conflict, the consequences of conflict for women, that type of issues, to bring them to the fore and have them, highlighted, and also everything that has to do with the whole issue of creating, sort of an equal playing ground, level ground for women and men. Of course, we are fully aware that having a feminist foreign policy is just, one step in the direction. There's a whole process of cultural change that needs to come with it, that it has to evolve in order that the patriarchal culture that we certainly have in Mexico and exists in many other countries, including here in India, that has to change. And of course, there's many other aspects of it that need to be addressed. So we can talk about that in a few minutes. But this is more or less, the process that we're engaged at the present time.
Thank you for sharing that. Lots of important points, including the importance of recognizing conflict and its disparate impact on genders. By the way, remiss of me not to welcome our audience. This is not a three-way conversation. We'd love to hear from you. So I'm encouraging you already to start posting your questions so I can then pose them to both our guests. Ambassador Puri, it's interesting that the 20-year mark was mentioned, because it's been 20 years since UNSCR 1325, almost the nodal point from when this entire conversation began. What is ironic, though, is for many countries, including like India, 20 years hence, we still don't have a national action plan. What is your sense of the road that's been covered so far, and where do you think we are in that learning curve of talking about a feminist foreign policy?
Well, let me first of all commend CAS and Kubernein Initiative for taking up gender mainstreaming of Indian foreign policy as a theme whose time has really come. I believe you have explored this as a less trodden field at some depth, from both retrospective and prospective angles, and drawn upon global trends, examples, and experiences for the lessons that we could draw for India and with India. Now, I'm myself very committed to the cause of engendering all policies, including foreign policy. I'm happy to see the ambassador of Mexico providing insights from Mexico. And I've had very, very positive and fruitful interaction with Mexico when I was with UN Women in several areas, including gender data. And more recently, I'm told that you have been very much in the leadership on the generation equality, campaign and movement. So it's wonderful to interact and share experiences. And now, as an Indian Foreign Service diplomat of 28 years and having served for 15 years in the UN, the wellspring, the UNI, which I call the wellspring of gender mainstreaming in international relations and foreign policy, and having led and founding, being the founding and building, engaged in the founding and building of the first integrated global institution for advancing gender equality and women's empowerment, the UN Women, you can imagine that this topic is very close to my heart. And I have seen, thought about, lived, and advanced the theme from both sides now, as John Michel's song goes, and even all sides now. And I recently put down my ideas in a paper on the subject under the auspices of the International Council, Indian Council for World Affairs. So let me pick up some ideas from there and put it in the context of gender mainstreaming of Indian foreign policy. Now, what is foreign policy? Definition and key elements of foreign policy interests include security, defense, strategic aspects, the trade, number two, trade, economic and technical cooperation and aid. The third aspect is social, human rights, cultural cooperation and interchange. The fourth now is an increasingly becoming important environmental cooperation. Then fifth, overall, contributing to the global public goods that are being put together at different fora and pursued at different fora. So if you're looking at the concept of gender mainstreaming, all these areas, what are we saying? Assess implications of any planned action on women and men, as was being said by the ambassador, for example, of conflict, and include in legislation, policies and programs in all areas and at all levels. Secondly, gender mainstreaming must be institutionalized through concrete steps, mechanisms, policies, budgets, monitoring and processing in all parts of the national government and the foreign policy architecture and establishment, as I'm sure Mexico is doing, or Sweden is doing, or other countries who have pledged this, Canada, Germany. Increase and broaden women's voice, participation and leadership at all levels of decision-making, as was being mentioned, personnel in particular, and the leadership. Then the targeted women-specific policies, actions, programs, and gender units and focal points are adopted, established. And the fifth is, of course, the political will and allocation of adequate, sustainable, substantially significant additional financial and human resources to be deployed. So applying what I call the Panchashila or 5 principles to Indian foreign policy would mean what? We would need to design and implement transversal policies and programs to advance national interests globally and with partner countries with a gender lens in all 5 areas, from strategic security to trade, social, cultural, environmental, global public goods engagements. Secondly, formulate and implement targeted policies and programs that indicate a certain priority and importance a country attaches to the values and goals of gender equality and women's empowerment in its bilateral, and I want to emphasize in its bilateral relations, in its plurilateral engagements, in regional and sub-regional engagements, and multilateral diplomacy and relations. So these are the. Then you take special temporary measures as affirmative action to make up for gender gaps, create a level playing field to ensure, as you were mentioning, Ambassador, a level playing field to ensure that women's voice, participation, and leadership is equally represented in foreign policy institutions and roles at headquarters and as ambassadors and representative in countries and in all fields of action whether it is hardcore border negotiations, military negotiations, trade agreements, or climate change, or peacekeeping, you name it. Women have a place everywhere and have an important role. Gender parity is crucial to making Indian foreign policy gender responsive. So for example, at present, at least that's the statistics I have, out of a total of about 731 IFS officers, 135 are female, which is an organic increase from a mere 5% when I joined the service in 1974 to 18.5% in 2020. So while there is progress, we have not yet reached the critical mass of 33%. We need to address that if necessary. And this is a suggestion I'm going to make. Through a combination of increase in inductions overall, I always believe that for a country of India's size and global stature, we are a very small service and need to increase our size and heft. This can be done through both increasing the number of inductees, women inductees, through UPSC exams, as also through lateral entry. At the same time, a quota system or reservation for women could be considered as a temporary special measure to drive up women's participation in Indian diplomacy. And I know there are many of my women colleagues who may not always agree with this, because there is this debate among women that we don't want any special, special leg up. We can get there on our own. But if we are to make up the lag at a decent pace and reach that critical mass, if not gender parity, then we need that. Another aspect to address relates to conditions of work. And in that respect, I can vouch for the fact that the MEA IFS has been quite a gender equal employer and shown great gender sensitivity to special concerns and circumstances of women officers in matters of posting, maternity leave, promotion, etc. These need to be institutionalized better. Now, I set out 6 gunas or qualities of excellence in relation to UN women as the fulcrum of what I call the new international feminist order, to which India is well placed to contribute through its gender responsive foreign policy. So the first guna is mimicking the institutional lead in the UN system UN Women has, establish a dedicated institutional gender focal point in the Prime Minister's office or Ministry of External Affairs that would coordinate with gender focal points in the ministries of defense, trade, industry, finance, environment, cultural, and social welfare ministries, etc. And on the bilateral with counterparts in key democracies, in plurilateral bodies, for example, G20, W20, IPSA, BRICS, regional, ASEAN, sub-regional, SAARC, and global, the UN, BWIs in the North and South and South-South, and triangular cooperation and projection of India's Nari Shakti, what we call women power, in different fields as soft power. Then second is follow in all of government and all of society approach to gender mainstreaming of foreign policy, and empower women's ministries, machinery, national commission to engage with and build networks. When I was with UN Women, we were trying to get all the women's ministries dialogue with each other, share experiences. That helps a lot, and it empowers them better with their with their foreign counterparts and UN agencies, and also drawing concerned civil society. That's the other all of society approach. Concerned civil society and women's organizations in such engagements, and as they are the repositories of global feminist expertise and inspiration in political economy to strategic security military issues. We have that expertise in the feminist space. So, harness that is something that is very important. Foster national gender disaggregated data, knowledge hubs and best practice repositories, and network with regional global ones. And I know UN Women is working with many statistics and gender institutions and countries, including Mexico, to strengthen these centers of excellence. then be proactive in global and regional norm and standard setting on gender equality and women's empowerment and its integration into relevant sectors, including sunrise areas of global norm setting that I'm sure we are engaging in, like Tech 4.0, IT, future of work. All these areas now should be engaged in by India in a gender responsive way. India can be a champion of what I have been calling the Global Gender Compact, which includes SDG 5, and of course, Beijing Platform for Action and all the other compacts that we have had. So we have, India has been by and large progressive including on culturally sensitive issues like sexual and reproductive health and rights, including abortion rights, and the role of the family. But because of our having to sometimes align with other countries like G77, we take more defensive collective positions. Now we should change and be the flag bearers of transformative and gender equality norms, which, as Ambassador said, should be a departure or should demolish patriarchy. Lead and support global and regional advocacy campaigns and movements, building on the successful Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, and other campaigns we have done in India, and demonstrate how we became a poster country for global campaigns like He for She. We even have a postal stamp. All our leaders have, embraced that campaign. So also we have so many international celebrities in India, use them to spread the word in India and elsewhere. Lastly, invest in and promote international and bilateral cooperation in practical, scalable, and replicable lighthouse programs, investing in women's skill building and training in partner countries. I used to at one time head the ITEC program of India, which is South-South cooperation in technical and economic cooperation, and support UN programs in sustainable development, peace and security, for example, using women peacekeepers, humanitarian actors, and aid workers for response, including, of course, in the area of climate change. I remember that MEA support, this was one of the Lighthouse programs, although it's not a very big project, but the Barefoot College project that supported rural grandmothers to become trainers and engineers, it became a global icon and brought much recognition to India's championship of women's empowerment globally. So let us, creatively come together and formulate such programs and implement such programs along with NGOs, along with private sector around the world that has India's women power stamp.
Thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack over there. So let me head straight back to Ambassador Salas. Let me take up the, I guess, slightly prickly point about institutionalizing representation, Ambassador Salas. What do the figures look like in terms of how, Mexico's foreign diplomats are cut gender-wise? And would you agree that perhaps percentage-wise representation or reservation of a sense is a good first step to organize that or to institutionalize it?
No, it certainly is, and I think that what Ambassador Puri has said. All these points are, quite well taken, and I think it describes in many ways, what Mexico has been doing or has been trying to do all these years in terms of implementing this feminist foreign policy. In the case of the foreign policy establishment of Mexico, we have had, traditionally, the foreign ministry of Mexico has probably been at the forefront of a more balanced representation. When we had our first women foreign minister, there was about 30% of the personnel of the foreign ministry, not just the foreign service, so the foreign ministry was women. That, of course, has increased considerably over the years. Right now, also in terms of the figures that we have, the Foreign Service of Mexico is about 1,300 members, of which still is there is no parity as such. However, one of the things that was done is that there has been a foreign service law reform in order to reach, with the goal of reaching gender parity within the foreign ministry or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs by 2024. And I think this is a doable goal because we're very, very, very close to that. And this means, the parity in all levels, not just in terms of ambassadors, women and men, but in all the ranks. One of the things that, as Ambassador Puri has said, is that we need to work in terms of recruiting more women and, inviting more women to participate in this kind of activities. And again, we need to overcome some of the limitations and prejudices that have existed over time. Sometimes it's not so easy for a woman to join the foreign service, and then when she becomes posted abroad, to bring her husband along if the husband is also has a job in Mexico, for example. So those things, there are ample examples where this is happening as we speak, but nonetheless, these are the kind of things that need to be overcome slowly and gradually over time in order to have a greater representation of women serving in the Mexican foreign policy establishment. So that is, but as I said, that is the goal. We're working towards that. We are trying to recruit more women into the ranks of the foreign service, and certainly also having more women just who may not be foreign service members participate in the activities of the foreign ministry in terms of as members of delegations to conferences that take place abroad, as representatives. We have some what we call political appointments in different positions, and some very distinguished and important embassies in Mexico are headed by women who are not necessarily or who are not members of the foreign service, but who are distinguished members of the Mexican society in different fields. And all of that, I think is helping move this thing along in order to reach that parity that we're looking for.
Let me ask you a follow-up question in that case, Ambassador Salas, on two other important counts. One, on the importance of political representation and its spillover impact on foreign policy, whether you think it's important for one to feed the other. And the second, something that Sweden has been quite vocal about, which is gender budgeting, looking specifically at the needs of girls and women and allocating resources, something Ambassador Puri also alluded to in her opening remarks, specifically to skill them in a way to make them more prepared for these kind of roles. On budgeting and political representation, do you think they are two very important pillars to feed into foreign policy, feminist foreign policy?
For me?
Yes, to you, Ambassador Salas.
Sorry. No, certainly, and this is something that we're also working in. A lot of course, having a feminist foreign policy is not something that happens in isolation. I mean, we're within the Mexican society as a whole, and there again there are many efforts being done as a society in order to create more gender parity. For example, in the question of access to basic education, having more women throughout Mexico having this access to education, and nowadays the numbers are very good. In 2020, we had about almost close to 90% of women in Mexico attended school, and that is I think that it's an important indication. In higher education, the numbers of women are also large in numbers in fields such as health, education, management, and sciences. Not so much in other fields such as engineering or manufacturing, construction, or IT. But that's because these are traditional fields, but there are breakthroughs that are taking place, and of course the whole issue of empowering the girls from the very beginning, in enabling them to have education and access to different opportunities, and also sort of empower conducting certain societal changes that need to be done, so that the girls, as they grow up, they can have a more they can aspire to have a professional development, a professional education. They can aspire to eventually, if even if they are married, to have their own independence, in the sense of, as I was saying, if they get assigned to a job abroad, that their husbands will be be supportive of that type of and of course follow with them in that type of circumstances. So this is something that it's on parallel lines that is being done. So it's not just the foreign ministry that has to achieve these changes or implement these changes, and is trying to do so, but there has to be the whole framework around it that also has to change. And as I said in my first intervention, this is something that is a gradual change. It's it takes time. Mexican society, very much like India society, is somewhat conservative, very family oriented. The roles of women have been assigned to some specific issues. That, as I said again, has been changing, is changing, but more of it has to be done. And one thing that is very important here is the question of role models. Having people like, someone like Ambassador Puri, for example. I'm sure that many young women in India, they see someone like her and the heights she has achieved professionally speaking, I think will be inspired to do something like that. But the same thing has to be done. We have people who are of in the arts and culture, actresses, etc. Writers, you name it, that can draw the imagination and the will of young women to know that they can aspire to do something more, that they can and that it is possible to do so. And that is something that will take time, but I have the feeling that at least in Mexico we're moving in that direction.
Sure. We've got some audience questions coming in as well. So maybe in the interest of time, I'll merge two questions to you, Ambassador Puri. I wanted your thoughts really on the gender budgeting issue, but I'll also add a question that's coming from Swati Prabhu, saying, considering the pandemic, is the time now right for India's Development Partnership Administration, the DPA reform, to relook at its institutional structure, particularly when you're focusing on SDGs or gender mainstreaming, their policy ideas? Will the two have to go hand in hand? Do we need to rethink our finances, and do we need to rethink how we're planning and plotting going ahead?
So first of all, let me look at a little bit of what was addressed earlier about Indian foreign policy, or any foreign policy, being a reflection of the strivings and of goals of a country at the national level as well. And therefore, I want to begin by saying that, yes, we must continue to push the frontiers of gender equality and women's empowerment in every area, whether it's political, economic, social, cultural, nationally, in order to also carry weight internationally as a gender equality champion. So having said, and therefore we must have more women in politics and political leadership. I'm a strong supporter of the women's reservation bill, and I hope sometime that will be brought in at the national level, building on the local government success of women's leadership and the quota being there. And also on the budgeting now. Let me come to the fact that gender equality is a subset of the, if not actually, it's transversely integrated into Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, which India has. You listen to even chief minister of UP says, I'm pursuing SDGs 1 I'm pursuing, so he's talking about everybody is now adopted these goals as national goals. So this is a subset of that, right? And an integral part of Agenda 2030. So naturally, one of the key elements of that is how do you financially drive that transformation? You need transformative financing, substantially increased financing. This is what I was saying. And you can do that very systematically. Also, that's the third aspect. It has to be systematically and institutionally provided for. And gender responsive budgeting, GRB, is a time-tested method of doing it. And India has adopted it. But there are certain that we still have some way to go to reach the ideal in that context. Now, of course, COVID has created new challenges, both in terms of what we need to do in order to support women's empowerment and gender equality. I was on another panel the other day on women's entrepreneurship and how differentially impacted women entrepreneurs were, for example, by the pandemic. And so we need to, of course, have a kind of affirmative action, both financially and in terms of specific steps that we take to help, whether it's women entrepreneurs, whether it is women's nutrition, health, all the parameters that we need to cover. And that also should reflect us in our international diplomacy and our support to partner countries in the developing world.
Mm. Do you feel, Ambassador Puri, that there needs to be a deeper look at the tone and tenor of the policies as they exist for feminist foreign policy? Because the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has said that he is in favor of the idea and the concept of building greater representation, but he says he doesn't believe what exists in its current form for other countries may be the best idea for India. Does some kind of cultural refitting or retrofitting, is that warranted, you think? Or do you think the policies as they exist are quite broad-based and you need to get the ball rolling and then see, what works and what doesn't?
But I've set out those five, the Panchashila of the 5 principles of gender mainstreaming. And that's what it is. Whether you call it by that name or not, it helps. Sometimes, as Ambassador said, role modeling is important. If you want to be called, whether you call it a feminist foreign policy or you call it by, you call yourself a gender responsive foreign policy, or a foreign policy that builds on Nari Shakti and builds Nari Shakti at home, in your neighborhood and in the world, it's different ways of presenting it, but as long as the spirit and substance of these 5 principles of mainstreaming are there, as far as I'm concerned, I'm okay with that.
Mm. Ambassador Salas, I also came across an interesting anecdote, which I think is quite real and quite human in terms of, outlining where the challenges lie, where I understand that for Mexico in international forums, Mexico would invite internal enemies, quote unquote, which is basically the most conservative section of policymakers, to go into the closed door meetings, to hear the point of view from someone else, and hopefully to change their own minds along the way. Has that been a conscious policy, and has that worked?
Well, I think it has been important to draw some different sectors of Mexican society to become aware of how other people are thinking, especially when of the international community. I mean, sometimes we do, especially in the political class, lives inside a bubble inside of Mexico. So it's been good to take them out and expose them to diametrically different ideas, or at least different points of views. And I think that this has, it has contributed. enhancing the debate that we've had in Mexico, and that there's a continuous debate. And where these things are always discussed. So the answer to your question is yes, it has helped. Absolutely.
If I may just add that, we've always, as advocates, as gender equality advocates, we've always believed that it is important to, of course, build up an echo chamber where like-minded people get together and, cogitate, celebrate, or express outrage. But it is really equally important to engage with those who are skeptical, who are opponents, who are, in fact, crusaders against the ideas that we are advocating and hoping to become a movement. So I think it's very, very important whenever we have a discourse on any issue, whether it's, and I mentioned to some of the so-called culturally contested ideas like sexual and reproductive health and rights. Abortion is a very, very hot and difficult issue in many countries, including in Latin America and North America. Fortunately, in India, we have one of the most liberal regimes. So these kind of issues, we need to engage. Sometimes we have harmful traditional practices. In India, you have this problem of khap panchayats and where, honor killings and all of those kind of, some of those issues that come up. We need to engage the traditional leaders, the male leaders, those people, those who have been, upholding these practices, harmful traditional practices, child marriage, campaign against child marriage, all of these, including, of course, this whole Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao campaign. It has been successful partly because it has engaged all those elements that were upholding all the principles of harmful patriarchy. So this is something that we really need to do. But I don't know.
No, absolutely. Yes, please.
If I may add something, I think this is a very, very, very interesting point because, many times as I said, I'm very happy that I'm participating in this debate and, whatever, Mexico can contribute in terms of ideas and, intellectual input, we're very happy to do so. But I think that, that when I think of what India is going through and what Mexico is going through, we're in many ways we have very similar societies, as I said before, in terms of family structure. But in Mexico also, how we have, some of this that we're discussing right now, 20, 30 years ago would have been unthinkable in Mexico. With the weight of the Catholic Church in Mexico, which is quite significant, with a very traditional patriarchal society, a very conservative political class, and when you compare where we were in the 80s and 90s to where we are now, not only in the questions of advancement of women and empowering of women, but other issues of LGBT rights and all this type of things. The change has been tremendously dramatic, and I think that if I have any recommendation or suggestion to make, if I may, is for India to look at where Mexico was and where we are right now, because I think it's it's comparable to what the experience in India could be. Because sometimes I hear people in India saying, "Oh, this is never going to change here because we're a society like this, or because religion is very strong, and the families are like so it's like the inevitability that nothing can change." And the truth of the matter is, we also felt that way a few decades ago, and everything has changed.
Very true. As someone recently told me, is it impossible? No, nothing is impossible.
Yeah,
So
true.
gotta get
Yeah.
started. Ambassador Puri, another that's coming from Akanksha Khullar. She says, how far do you think Indian foreign policy establishments have been able to mainstream gender issues and concerns? I think you've answered a lot of this, so I want to sort of nuance this a little bit specifically to conflict, Ambassador Puri. I think as we draw an end to the year, the biggest story would be what has occurred in Afghanistan, and specifically the kind of impact that women have faced as an outcome of the conflict. Do you think Indian foreign policy has been able to mainstream that conversation?
Well, I think you earlier mentioned women, peace and security in the UN. And India has been a strong champion of the women, peace and security agenda in the UN Security Council and in the UN and in the whole gamut of peace making. I'm using these words carefully: peacemaking, peace building, and peacekeeping, right? So this is something that is very much part of Indian foreign policy, even when they are members, non-permanent members. Right now, India was the chair when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. And I've done an article on that. And one of the key elements of the very important resolution that was adopted under the presidency of India on 30th of August specifically has very gender sensitive and gender responsive provisions, where Taliban government is asked to respect women's rights, asked to be inclusive of women in government formation, asked to be sensitive to their humanitarian needs, etc. So India has been in its women, peace and security agenda, both in the context of UN, but also bilaterally, wherever it has engaged. It has been very sensitive to the gender, dimensions of both conflict and humanitarian situations that arise from conflict.
No, thank you for that answer. I am conscious of time, but I feel like in a short matter of time, we managed to check a lot of boxes. So I'm very grateful to both my guests for adding so much insight in their answers. Let me hand it back to Priyanka now for the rest of the proceedings. Priyanka.
Thank you very much, Mitali, and thank you again, Ambassador Puri and Ambassador Salas, for being with us here today and providing these fantastic insights. This video will be available on YouTube, and we will share it with all the attendees as well, in case anybody else would like to listen in later. I would now like to invite to give the closing remarks Mr. Peter Rimmele, Resident Representative to India, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. Mr. Rimmele has extensive experience on governance reforms and has lived and worked in countries including East Timor, Republic of Indonesia, Rwanda, and Lebanon. Over to you, Mr. Rimmele.
Well, thank you. Dear all, first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to Ambassador Lakshmi Puri and Ambassador Federico Salas, and to the brilliant moderation of Ms. Mukherjee for providing us with a highly thought-provoking session in which I learned much more than I can possibly append in my concluding remarks now. Having said that, I'd like to briefly synthesize my understanding of the concept of gender mainstreaming per se and in relation to India in particular. An understanding that I'm very pleased to say I have acquired not only today, but also in previous discussions and workshops that we as the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation have organized together with the Kubernein Initiative. A crucial resultant point in this context is that we all need to understand that mainstreaming is not about adding a women's component or even a gender equality component to an existing activity. It is about more than just increasing women's participation. Mainstreaming puts gender at the center of policy decisions, medium-term plans, program budgets, and institutional structures, as well as processes. Mainstreaming means incorporating women's and men's perceptions, experiences, knowledge, and interests into policymaking, planning, and decision-making. Mainstream can evince that goals, policies, and measures need to be changed to ensure that both women and men can influence, participate in, and benefit. And that's at the end, the goal, benefit from development processes. On the other hand, it may also require changes in organizational structures, procedures, and cultures to create an environment conducive to promoting gender equality. In short, mainstreaming is not an end itself, but a means to the goal of gender equality, and should therefore be an essential component of an Indian foreign policy, a Mexican one, or for that matter, any country's foreign policy that strives for more equality, with Germany, of course, also not being an exception at all. If I calculate the time difference properly, Chancellor Angela Merkel, the first female chancellor we had for 16 years, has left office in the very moment, and the new chancellor is elected by the parliament, and the new cabinet will be a gender parity has been achieved between female ministers and male ministers. And the first time in German history, again, we have a female foreign minister, and we will have a female minister of interior. So things seem to change slowly, but surely. I think we all agree here today that it will be a bumpy road towards achieving these changes in decision-making. And we had the sample of Afghanistan. Ambassador Puri mentioned the sustainability development goals related to it. What we do is not always sustainable. We see that, unfortunately, in what has been achieved in Afghanistan and how it's stepping back. So we have to realize that as well. But however, it is a road that is well worth taking. And both ambassadors emphasized it, it's far from unattainable. Moreover, all of us virtually present here today can be very proud of the fact that we are part of an initiative which is actively taking these first steps to advance the current discourse around a feminist foreign policy in the world's largest democracy, while the conversation is still in infancy in West, that too in small elitist circles. It is only through such initiatives that we can offer greater diversity of thought and enable global policy to be tailored and thus also operationalized across a wider geographical area, taking into account very different social norms and practices as well as life histories. And to all the critics who still do not believe in the possibility of a feminist foreign policy framework in India, I suggest a conversation with our two ambassadors here today. And in the rare case that this would not change the minds of them, I leave you with a quote by the writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who once stated, "Culture does not make the people, people make the culture." Yeah. Now, if it is true that the full humanity of women is not our culture, then we can and must make it our culture. Yeah. And I think that is our goal. I think once I mentioned before, most countries would have written in their constitutions, maybe definitely Latin American countries, India, Germany, gender parity by saying men and women are equal, maybe with the exception of the Arab world. As long as we're still discussing that, we have not achieved that goal of our constitutions. So let's continue to work on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rimmele. I would like to thank again our panelists, Ambassador Puri, Ambassador Salas, and our moderator, Mitali Mukherjee, and also our team at Kubernein Initiative, as well as the India office of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for bringing this together, and a wonderful audience that has put out some interesting questions through the session as well. Look forward to continuing the engagement on this topic. Thank you very much. I will be ending the webinar now.